Imagine you're standing on the bank of the Columbia River, about 40 miles north of Portland, Oregon, and you can see in the distance a nuclear power plant. It has a large cone-like tower that looks a lot like the cartoon nuclear power plant in The Simpsons. In fact, this is the tower that Simpsons creator Matt Groening used as the basis for the Springfield nuclear plant where Homer Simpson works. Because this is the Trojan nuclear power plant that Groening saw when he grew up in Oregon. It generated power here for nearly 20 years. Okay, now imagine that gray tower imploding in a large cloud of concrete dust. The Trojan nuclear power plant was Oregon's first and only commercial nuclear facility. It was a controversial project built by Portland General Electric in the 1970s. As you can imagine, there were a lot of protests. PGE eventually closed Trojan after decades of regulatory violations, forced shutdowns, construction flaws, costly repairs, and relentless anti-nuclear protests. It was demolished in 2006. Voters passed a ballot measure in 1980, creating strict rules for nuclear power that effectively killed the industry in Oregon. To address concerns about the safety of nuclear power and radioactive waste, Oregon lawmakers created the Nuclear and Thermal Energy Council. The council lives on, and it has been rebranded as the Energy Facility Siting Council to cover more than just nuclear power. Now, the council and the rules associated with it could be one reason that Oregon is lagging behind almost every other state when it comes to renewable energy projects. That's because activists who oppose those projects have used the processes of public hearings and lawsuits originally set up to hamper nuclear power plants to oppose all kinds of other energy projects. That includes projects you'd think that people opposed to nuclear power might be in favor of.
I mean, there's one individual in Oregon who has appealed almost every wind farm that's ever been built, and even projects that aren't even, in the area where this person lives. So it's a pretty low bar for who gets to appeal and drag projects out through that state process.
From the Gert Boyle studio, I'm Jen Chavez, and this is The Evergreen, a podcast from OPB about the place you call home. Nicole Hughes is the president of Renewable Northwest, a nonprofit that advocates and lobbies for renewable power. And the person she's talking about is Irene Gilbert.
I'm Irene Gilbert. I'm from the Grande, Oregon.
OPB investigative reporter and editor Tony Schick recently featured Irene in a story he did for OPB and ProPublica.
She is a retired state employee, avid elk hunter, former gun store owner in La Grande who feels very passionately about protecting rural landscapes from what she views as unnecessary energy development. So Irene has filed more challenges to energy projects in the state of Oregon than any other individual, according to the Department of Energy, the people who field these. And I just thought that was fascinating, like what motivates a person to take that on. And who is this person who is so good at using this system, so relentless, that renewable energy advocates are like, when they think about it.
One of the most fascinating things about Irene Gilbert is that she doesn't fit neatly into a box. According to Tony, she considers herself an environmentalist, but she's not who you might think of when you think about that label.
She talks about wildlife and the environment the way that you would expect like a Portland area liberal to, and yet she is a conservative Republican. She opposes, large-scale clean energy farms, but she owns a cabin that has solar panels on it that's powered by solar panels.
According to Irene, she has a reputation among energy industry leaders as well as activists.
I get contacted periodically from landowners or from people who are fighting other energy developments just because they'll have an issue and I have a pretty good understanding of what the rules say and what is required. I'm not a legal expert, but so many years I've spent studying these rules that people will call me and ask if there's a statute that supports them, or, as a non-attorney, how would I approach this? And my advice is free,
This is probably a good time to mention that Tony interviewed Irene in a hallway at the Oregon Capitol building during the legislative session. She was there to testify against a piece of legislation she felt would hamper her ability to make her voice heard on various energy projects. So, what drives Irene? Why is she so opposed to these projects that she'll volunteer hours and hours of her time filing lawsuits and attending public meetings?
I have a real understanding of how landowners and farmers and ranchers, how they view the relationship with the land as being protectors and stewards of the land. And so when a utility company that doesn't have that same connection wants to come in and forcefully require these landowners to give up property that they have been stewards of for sometimes multiple generations, they're not going to protect the land. And they infringe on the actual owner's ability to make a living on the land, to continue doing what they're doing there. And so I just feel anything I can do to help them fight those kinds of intrusions.
As you might imagine, Irene's perspective is informed by her own personal experience. Decades ago, she married into a ranching and timber family, and a chunk of the forest she owned was bulldozed for a transmission line. She blamed the line when she couldn't get the timber to grow as she wanted. She also had a stark memory of how quickly a business can erase a beloved part of rural Oregon. The company that owned Kinzu, the timber town where she grew up, razed it without a trace after shutting down operations in 1978.
I feel like my reason for participating now is to do what I can to help these poor folks. They're taking land from people who have never dealt with the government before, who have no clue what's going to happen to them.
Irene is no stranger to complex state regulations. She worked as a trainer for the Oregon Department of Human Services and later Oregon Occupational Safety and Health, where she taught people how to understand the statutes that guided their work.
So I do understand bureaucracy pretty well.
She doesn't just understand it. On some level, she enjoys it.
Studying the statutes and figuring out whether or not an agency is doing what they're supposed to be doing is very stimulating to me.
Though she has gained a reputation in certain circles, Irene says she still feels like she's underestimated.
I've been called an old lady who has access to a computer. That's kind of I guess, how I'm viewed, and okay. I guess that's okay.
One of the first big projects that Irene opposed was the Antelope Ridge Wind Farm. It was 2009, and only a handful of wind farms existed in Oregon. But an energy company suddenly wanted to put up 180 turbines across the scenic Grand Ronde River Valley just outside La Grande.
And some people who were part of a group called Friends of the Grand Ronde Valley got a hold of me because they knew some experience that I had and that I could be helpful to them.
She joined the group and spoke against the wind farm at public hearings. She argued against the wind farm before the Oregon Energy Facility Siting Council, which has ultimate authority over whether major pieces of infrastructure like wind farms, solar projects, power plants, and transmission lines get built.
And ended up writing a letter to the governor about it, mentioning that she would sue over it, mentioning that in a lawsuit, all of the state's dealings with energy companies would, become public. And then that project never materialized, and she takes some credit for that. She feels like she played a part in stopping that.
There were some really strange things going on politically around Antelope Ridge, and we were successful in stopping that. The company would say that it was a financial decision. I think it was more than that.
Coming up after a break, we'll hear about the project that has become Irene's White Whale, a 300-mile transmission line planned to cut across eastern Oregon. Thank you for listening to The Evergreen, our podcast from OPB about the place you call home. If you dig what you hear, subscribe to us on your favorite podcast app, and we'll brighten your Monday morning a little bit with something new and exciting to listen to each week. You can also follow OPB on Instagram at OPB Photo, or follow me directly at Jen Chavez OPB. That is Jen with 2 N's. And I'll keep you posted on everything Team Evergreen is up to. And remember, this episode about renewable energy and all the great OPB reporting and storytelling you hear on the show is made possible by the support of many thousands of OPB members. And that support is especially important to us now, ever since Congress wiped out federal funding for public media, including 9% of OPB's annual budget. Thank you to everyone who stepped in to help us close that gap and sustain our mission of providing free, high-quality news and information to everyone in our region. If you haven't yet, support our journalism by becoming an OPB sustaining member today at opb.org/pod. And now, back to Irene Gilbert and her fight against renewable energy projects in Eastern Oregon.
Welcome to a special Energy Experts React recording of Public Power Underground. Public Power Underground is an infotainment program that covers electric utility and electric utility adjacent topics from a power department's perspective. We talk about the energy enthusiast trifecta of markets, people, and electrification. And today we're focused on...
There really is a podcast out there for every person, including energy executives.
They talk about really wonky, nerdy utility stuff. On the About page, I really enjoy this tagline. They say, the Public Power Underground, it's work to watch. So I am one of the people who watched it, though, admittedly for work. And I was a little bit captivated by the story that Adam Richens, the chief operating officer of Idaho Power, was telling about the transmission line he was trying to get built. At this point, they were in year 16 of trying to get it built.
Just to set the scene for you, Adam Richens, the podcast host Paul Dockery, and 2 other power industry players are sipping drinks and sitting in black leather wingback chairs at Patty's Bar and Grill in downtown Portland. At this point, Adam is talking about the Oregon State permitting application for his transmission line.
Close to 20,000 pages.
Wow.
Just to give you an idea how thorough that process is. Okay, so 2022, we get the permit for EPSEC.
Nice.
That's pretty good, but then guess what happens?
I bet you got sued.
Dun, dun, dun.
Dun, 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 we got sued.
And I bet you can guess who sued them. Irene Gilbert, of course. The transmission line is called the Boardman to Hemingway line, or B2H for short. The plan is to build a 300-mile high-voltage transmission line through eastern Oregon to connect Idaho green energy suppliers with Oregon data centers that demand loads of electricity. The fight against B2H is the biggest one Irene has taken on yet.
I'm co-chair of the Stop B2H nonprofit, which has been involved with the Boardman to Hemingway transmission line project since it started.
They raised $350,000 in donations. Most of those were smaller donations of less than $1,000 from people in Eastern Oregon or Western Idaho, and that paid for legal fees for these types of challenges.
They have filed a total of 117 appeals, a process that has dragged on for years, frustrating people like Adam Richens.
I was arguing before the court in Union County about this jurisdiction thing, and one of the bosses from Idaho Power came up to me and asked me, what would it take for you to be satisfied with what Idaho Power is doing? And I said, for me to be satisfied, you would need to treat the landowners fairly and provide just mitigation for the damages that you cause through building this transmission line. That's the point where I would not be involved in this. I never heard anything else from them, of course, because that was my answer.
One of Irene's Stop B2H allies is the group's treasurer, Jim Creeder. He also lives in La Grande.
They nail us as NIMBYs, and it's kind of like, we know the line has to exist, but you have to work with landowners. You can't sit in a desk and do a Google search and go, oh, this is a good place to put the line. And that's kind of what happened. We met with Idaho Power people to tell them certain things, and they go, oh, we didn't know that, thank you. Then they go change the route.
According to a spokesperson for Idaho Power, the company has altered the transmission line's path numerous times in response to public feedback. But earlier this year, Irene and her group lost their last appeal. The B2H line is moving forward.
They have broken ground on the line in a few places. In other places, they are still working through agreements with landowners for easements and compensation and micro-siting the line, like, will it go 10 feet this way, 10 feet that way, that sort of thing. But they have started actually, pouring some concrete in a few places.
So Irene succeeded in slowing down the process and making some changes along the way, but she couldn't stop the transmission line. Oregon is one of only 10 states with statewide energy standards, and renewable energy developers consider its approval process one of the most rigorous in the country. It took 20 years to get the Boardman to Hemingway transmission line underway. But Oregon's Assistant Director for Energy Siting, Todd Cornett, says the process is working as intended.
It was designed this way by the legislature. It was designed to be very inclusive, to be transparent. There are multiple opportunities for public participation.
Some Oregon lawmakers disagree.
And I said, that's a ridiculous length of time when it's taking 20 years to build a new line.
State Rep Mark Gamba is a Democrat from the Portland area and vice chair of the House Committee on Climate, Energy, and Environment. He says he'd like to get the process down to more like 5 years.
There was one bill this session that took a step in that direction that said, if you file a lawsuit over this, your lawsuit goes directly to the Supreme Court. You don't file a lawsuit and then, appeal it through the courts over time. It goes straight to the state Supreme Court. There have been bills over the years that lawmakers have rejected that would have taken steps in the direction of not only speeding up energy, but also addressing some of the concerns of people who are worried about rural development, people like Irene.
Most of those legislative efforts have fizzled, but Mark Gamba's bill requiring legal challenges to go straight to the Oregon Supreme Court did pass. Irene objected to it, of course, but it won't stop her.
I do what little piece I can to support these farmers and timber folks that are up against the government bureaucracy.
Renewable energy advocates say Oregon's slow process for approving energy projects is one reason the state ranks near the bottom of all 50 states for green energy growth, despite setting a deadline to eliminate fossil fuel use by 2040. But Tony points out that that's not the whole story.
We don't have the ability to move energy to the places we need it from the places we can generate it. So there are tons of projects right now that want to get built, wind and solar type projects, that can't connect to the grid because there's no room for them. And they're stuck waiting for a chance to plug into the grid. And the reason they can't get transmission is because there's no transmission, in part because it's so hard to get it built. And so these things kind of feed each other in a way.
Tony has covered energy issues in Oregon for years and from so many different angles. In fact, the very first episode of The Evergreen I ever produced was a conversation with him about hydroelectric policy and salmon preservation, which he also did a whole podcast series about called Salmon Wars, by the way. Anyway, what I have learned from Tony over and over is that energy is complicated. and that there's so many different needs and interests being weighed with every single project or policy. That's clear here, too, when we think about Irene and the unlikely coalition of people she works with and how difficult she is to even categorize. One thing I really find striking about this story is the irony, perhaps, that policies put into place during the 70s era conservation movement in the name of environmentalism are now sometimes running counter to progressive goals, including environmental ones like wind energy. It's super fascinating to think about the way our ideas of doing what's best for the environment vary and change over time as our region, our climate, and the systems with which we govern ourselves change too. And to think about people like Irene, who put so much time and energy into operating within those systems, not because it's their job, but just because they live here. For Irene's part, she says now that the B2H transmission line is going forward, she's going to be watching for new applications for wind and solar projects associated with it.
I figure I'm going to be really busy.
Tony Schick is an investigative reporter and editor for OPB and ProPublica. You can read his story about Irene Gilbert and all of the in-depth reporting he and the rest of our climate and environment team have been doing at opb.org. Thank you for listening to The Evergreen, a podcast from OPB. Julie Sabatier produced this episode, and our technical director is Stephen Cray. Nalene Silva engineered the episode. The OPB podcast team also includes Mia Estrada, Peter Frick-Wright, Sage Van Wing, and for the last time, the Evergreen's Snowden intern, Malia Fass. We have loved having her on our team. She is so thoughtful, creative, determined, and up for anything. Stay tuned for more of her work, some great At Work With interviews, and a podcast episode about Rothko that we are saving up for you. Malia, thank you, we love you, and we cannot wait to see your journalism career blossom even more. Tony Schick did the interviews you heard in this episode. And thanks to the folks at the Public Power Underground podcast for letting us use some of their audio. The music in this episode is from Audio Network. And if you have a question for us, remember, you can just reach out and ask. Send us an email at theevergreen@opb.org. I'm Jen Chavez. Catch you later.